all I can envision are the many families that have sat in my office and explained to them, that your child has epilepsy and I don't know when the next seizure is going to come. And, just this stricken look on their faces, like, what do you mean? How am I going to sleep if I don't know if my child's having a seizure? What can I do? And then when you, as a physician, you look in the literature and say, okay, well, what can we do? Well, the state of the art right now is telling people to sleep next to their child. That's pretty primitive.
Hello, everyone. My name is Christine Minato. I'm the director of the UCSF Rosamond Institute at the University of California, San Francisco. And welcome to the Health Technology Podcast. Today, we have Dr. Rachel Kuperman, who was medical director at UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital in Oakland for 10 years. She developed the hospital's epilepsy program, including surgery and clinical research. As you will hear from her today, childhood epilepsy is a devastating condition that is hard to live with, and especially terrible for parents because there's no good way to predict when a seizure is going to occur. She tells us a lot about epilepsy in today's talk, what it's like for children, parents, and physicians. And now she stepped back from her clinical work to take up a new role. She is the CEO of Eysz, that's spelled Eysz, a startup developing wearable technology for epilepsy patients to get data on their seizures. The data from the devices will help doctors and parents understand their children's epilepsy and ultimately translate into better quality of life for the patient. Enjoy this talk, and if you like what you hear today, please subscribe to our podcast on iTunes. One more thing. Come join us to our 6th annual Rosamond Symposium on June 19 here at UCSF Mission Bay campus. Our speakers include John Grudelaars, CEO of Hillrom, Dr. T.P. McKinsey of UCSF, who performed the world's first stem cell transplant to a fetus last summer. Also featured this year is Stan Rowe, CEO of Next Biomedical, a partnership with Deerfield Management, where Deerfield has put aside up to $275 million to this project. Check out this year's lineup at our website, rosamondinstitute.org. Well, thank you for joining me today, Rachel. I thought when we first met, what your work in the epilepsy space has been really fascinating. And I thought there will be, this is an opportunity for us to share about your work and the epilepsy as a disease to our listeners. But before we start there, I just thought maybe we should start about your background. You're a pediatric neurologist, but how do you get there and why do you decide to be in that field?
Yeah, so my undergraduate degree was in physics.
Okay.
I was one of just a couple of women at UCSD studying physics, and it was a great background to do just about anything. And I knew I wanted to go into medicine, UCSF was really my first choice for medical school, and I was very excited to end up here. I was actually an MD PhD student initially, and found...
Here at UCSF?
Here at UCSF, yeah. And I found that the lab was too lonely for me. And I realized that when I took up long-distance running, and I'm not an athlete, so I figured it was time to go back, complete medical school, and really kind of focus on the patient connection.
But it's interesting that you're doing physics because a lot of pre-med students tend to be doing biology, not physics as many.
Yeah, so my father is a physicist, and I was young when I went to college, and I had no idea what I wanted to study.
You're one of those child prodigy.
No, I wouldn't say that, but I was definitely open to almost any field. And I was strongly encouraged by my father to try physics, and I really enjoyed it. So that's how I ended up in that field.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, sorry to interrupt, but then you went to MD PhD program at UCSF.
Right. Yes, and I was one of the dropouts. I did a year of research. It was actually in pain, and had a great thesis advisor, but it just wasn't a good fit in in terms of where I was. I was so excited about medical school and about patient care, and to be kind of pulled out 2 years into medical school felt really hard. And my cohort kept going, and I was doing research, and the connection with the research just wasn't there for me at the time. So I decided to go back and complete medical school.
Okay. And then?
Yeah, so then I became fascinated by neurology. We had some amazing teachers, including Dan Lowenstein here at UCSF, and that became my passion.
While you were a medical student?
While I was a medical student. And then at the time, Donna Ferrara ran the child neurology program here, and what an amazing mentor and teacher. And I decided to pursue child neurology. So I applied to residency, and I had it in my head that I really wanted to go to New York City. It was a dream of mine to live in New York City. So that's where I went. I did my child neurology training at Columbia. And then I had met my husband in January, just a couple weeks before the match. But, you can't make decisions on someone you meet 2 weeks ago. So it turns out he followed me to New York, and then I promised we'd come back to California. So that's how I ended up back here at UCSF doing my fellowship.
Okay. And how long were you in New York City?
5 years.
Okay. And you is in the neurology space?
So I was 2 years at NYU doing pediatrics, and then 3 years at Columbia doing child neurology.
Okay.
And had great mentorship there as well. Mark Patterson, who's now at Mayo, and Daryl DeVivo, just amazing teachers.
And then you kept your promise and you moved to California.
Came back to California, lived on this campus for a year, just when there was when there was absolutely nothing around here except for the housing and the gym and Genentech Hall. And
that was 15 years ago now?
That was 2008.
10 years ago? No, 20 years ago.
10
years
11.
ago. 11 years ago. My math is so bad.
And then I did my neurophysiology epilepsy training here, and then took a job at UCSF Children's Hospital in Oakland.
Okay. And what do you do there?
Yeah, so I was the medical director of the epilepsy program for 10 years and developed a surgical program with Curtis Augusti. And there hadn't been any epilepsy surgery done at that campus before, so we developed it as well as clinical research in epilepsy. And really my focus was on building a robust clinical program that could really serve the needs of the community.
What do you mean by that, build a clinical program? What does that entail?
Yes. So the main epilepsy is a challenging disease to care for. It's very scary for families to get that diagnosis, and there's a lot of stigma around the diagnosis. And it's really about providing kind of the social work support, the neuropsych support, having families be able to be in contact as much as possible, and really providing the support so that the families can make the best decisions for their child. And, as time kept going, there's been a lot more misinformation that you have to work with, and I think in many ways, a lot more fear generated from the internet. And, that's been one of the harder parts of medicine.
What kind of thing that triggered this fear? What information spread through the internet, which is...
So I think one of the challenges for families is to separate expert opinion from opinion. And there's a lot of opinions that you find online that aren't necessarily helpful. For instance, what I would tell families is if someone has a really good experience, you don't tend to feel a strong need to go write about, I just had a great experience with this drug. So when you look up a drug, what you tend to find is I just had a horrible experience with fill in the blank. So I think that's really hard for families, that when they look up a suggestion from their physician, what they see is kind of a horror show of side effects and
nothing
such.
Works.
Yeah. And then, many of the foundations which do a great job supporting families have parent forums or family forums that aren't really places of great information. And so there's a lot of misinformation that I think really challenges families to make good decisions.
Mm-hmm. So where do you play as the medical director, building the clinical program in addressing that?
Yeah, so one of the things we worked on was creating documents for families so that they could see what, the information, for example, with medication lists. If you're on this medication, these are the common side effects, right? It was hard, and you have to be able to communicate that to lots of different types of people from different backgrounds. So that's always been challenging. And I found that working in a team could really help. For instance, our nurse practitioner was much better at communicating certain things to families than I was, or pulling information out that I wasn't getting. Or our nursing assistant similarly could say, hey, did you know that this was an issue? And I'm like, no, I didn't. So, that teamwork approach, I think, is what, is the most important thing in medical care, really, to make sure that all facets are working towards the same goal, which is making sure that the child has excellent care.
Mm-hmm. So right now, how is epilepsy currently diagnosed? Or, how does the patient get to you?
So epilepsy is just a definition for having a tendency to have seizures. And the old definition really required that a child have at least 2 seizures, for example. So most children come to us after either a first seizure or a febrile seizure. And
what is febrile seizures?
So febrile seizures is very common. Almost 5% of children in the United States will have a febrile seizure. And what it is a seizure that occurs within the first 24 hours of a febrile illness in children under 5 years of age, typically between 1 and 5. And they're benign, but very scary. And they can be long, up to 15 minutes, and still be considered benign. So that's a pretty scary experience for a parent or someone to watch their loved one, especially a young child, seize for that period of time.
And by the time they reach 5 years old, that condition disappears.
They outgrow it.
Okay.
And what's so interesting, too, is, for instance, if we meet someone in the emergency room, for instance, they won't necessarily know that they, for instance, as a child had febrile seizures. But then they come to the follow-up appointment. They're like, oh, it turns out grandma said that I had 3 febrile seizures, and my husband had febrile seizures too, and we didn't know. And then people come out of the woodwork. And it's funny because as I've been talking to people about my research, the same thing happens where they say, oh, I actually have a personal connection to epilepsy. And then they'll list somebody, a family member, a father, a loved one who has seizures. And my co-founder mentioned to me, he said, I had no idea there were so many people with epilepsy. And I said, well, that's an excellent example of the stigma of epilepsy, which is that here you have this fairly prevalent condition that nobody talks about. But when you bring it up as a safe thing to talk about, suddenly all these people come out and say, no, this affects me, this affects a loved one.
So is that most of them are the febrile seizure, and then they had it when after 5, and then they kind of outgrow it? That's why people don't talk about it.
So febrile seizures are not considered epilepsy. Okay. So epilepsy is considered unprovoked seizures. So for a good example would be a post-traumatic injury, such as a injury involving like penetrating brain injury that occurs in soldiers. After that, you can develop epilepsy from the scarring associated with the injury. There's also a whole host of genetic causes of epilepsy. In young children, cerebral palsy can be a cause of epilepsy. So anything that can injure the brain can cause seizures. There's also a whole host of genetic benign causes. So, for example, absence epilepsy occurs in normal children with normal intelligence, and they have a couple of years of susceptibility, and then they tend to outgrow it. Some of them continue to have that seizure type, but it's very common.
Okay. And so the febrile seizure is not epilepsy. So then you're taking care of more
chronic.
The chronics. So can you tell us more about what that entails, what the symptoms, what's the quality of life that impact the patient like this, and what's the current solution?
So chronic epilepsy care typically involves workup to figure out why somebody's having seizures. So that could be an MRI, for instance, or a CT scan, genetic testing, and an EEG to help classify what type of epilepsy that they have. based on that classification and better understanding of why this is happening, then typically medical decisions are made about treatment options. About 50% of the time, we don't have a great answer as to why somebody's having seizures.
Even with the MRI?
Even with the MRI, that's correct.
And usually they come to you because they have certain symptoms. That's why they kind of think, let's go check the brain. I mean, how that go?
They're usually referred after an unprovoked seizure. So for example, a child in the middle of the night would convulse. The parent would find them, bring them to the emergency room. They would get acute treatment in the emergency room, and then they would be referred by their pediatrician to a neurologist for additional workup.
And then that's when they're being prescribed the MRI.
Right. So at that point, either not usually in the emergency room, but usually with the neurologist, an MRI is ordered and an EEG is done.
Okay.
So the MRI is to look for a structural reason for them to be having seizures, and the EEG is to get an idea of what the electrical signature is of the seizures so that you can get a better idea of how to classify it.
This podcast is sponsored by Life Science, a Silicon Valley-based medtech design and development consultancy, transforming your technologies into a unique healthcare solution. For more information, visit their website at iolifescience.com. This podcast is also sponsored by Brown Ratnick's Global Life Sciences Group, a team of legal professionals that helps life science companies, lenders, and investors around the world turn good science into good business. Learn more at brownratnick.com. So you mentioned 50% of the time you don't know why they have the seizure, even though you have the MRI and the EEG. Why is that?
Because the brain is complicated. I think, many of those answers will likely be genetic in the future, and there's a lot of research being done at many places, including UCSF, to understand that. An MRI is like taking a picture of a mountain from 20 miles away, right? So if there's a big change in the mountain, you'll see it, but, you're still 20 miles away and you can't see the crags and trees and specifics. So, it's a limited tool.
Mm-hmm. So what do you do? I mean, the 50%, the cause of it, and hopefully is there a treatment for that? And the 50%, you don't know what the cause of it, but they still have that seizure, and how do you treat them? So
the crazy thing is that even if you know the cause or you don't know the cause, the treatment isn't that different. That's because the treatments are very non-specific. So epilepsy treatments are geared towards decreasing the amount of excitation in the brain that causes seizures or increasing the amount of inhibition to prevent seizures. So all the medicines work through different channels or neurotransmitters to change that balance to get it more towards a normal level where they won't seize in daily life. So the medicines are very non-specific, and the medicines aren't just working on the networks that cause seizures, they're working on all the brain networks. So that's why they cause side effects like drowsiness, problems with learning. And so that's one of the big challenges of treatment is that you're, not just directed at the area that's problematic, you're kind of throwing something at the whole brain.
Mm-hmm. So, right, because it's not targeted specific enough. I assume there's a different dosing for different level of severity of the disease, or there's not even that?
So at this point, we're in a not so scientific method of dosing. So, we know dosing ranges based on weight. Physicians like to start with one drug at the lowest possible dose to try to find the minimum dose to control seizures. Sometimes more than one medicine is required. It can be a balancing effect between seizure control and side effects. And for some people, medicines don't work. So for about a third of the population who has epilepsy, even with the best available medical treatments, they continue to have seizures. And that population is then has what we call pharmacoresistant epilepsy or refractory epilepsy. And then other treatment options can be considered for them.
What kind of treatment do they get?
So the ketogenic diet is one treatment option. The ketogenic diet's been known since, let me rephrase that. So we've known since biblical times that starvation prevents seizures. And that has to do with the production of ketone bodies, which act like an anticonvulsant in the brain. So what the ketogenic diet does is it confuses the body into thinking that it's starving, but giving it enough calories to produce ketone bodies, which then can help people who have epilepsy that don't respond to seizure medicines. And that's something that we offer at UCSF, and it's been fantastic for certain patients. It's really hard, though.
Right. So maybe you can explain to us, like, what is ketogenic diets for some of us who don't know what that is?
So it's all the rage right now in dieting.
I know, that's right.
It's interesting. There's, which is positive for the people who have epilepsy because it means that there's a lot more products available to make it easier.
Like the whole gluten-free thing.
Right. There's a lot more products. The challenge is that in the ketogenic diet, 4 times the calories come from fat as from protein and carbohydrates combined in the classic ketogenic diet. That ratio changes as the ratio goes up from like a modified Atkins diet, which is a 1-to-1 ratio of fat to protein and carbs. The dose-related effect gets better too with the epilepsy treatment. The downside is it's a very unnatural way to eat. It's hard to get fiber. It's hard to get vitamins from eating mostly fat. And especially in children, they can feel full long before they've gotten their nutritional needs and caloric needs. So it can be hard to get them to finish the food. So they require close monitoring. You end up with this kind of fruity breath when you're ketotic.
Okay. I read it somewhere. I think it was in the UCSF news article talking about how hard it is to keep that kind of diet. And so the study is not quite clear because most people cannot really be strict to that kind of diet. Is this something that's possible for the epilepsy patient to have that strict diet?
So I definitely could not stay on a ketogenic diet. I give kudos to all the people that do. So the best population or the best kind of group for the ketogenic diet tend to be very young children who aren't kind of opening the fridge and picking out food for themselves. So it tends to be a lot easier to do because it may involve just a formula switch. Or in a young toddler, it just involves kind of changing the food. In older kids, when food becomes medicine, then it can really change the way they interact with their peers. And there's enough challenges in that domain if you have epilepsy that I would say, it's kept more as a last resort. I have a couple successful families, though, who have school-age kids. And, everybody buys in that it's important.
Does it work, the diet? Does it really address the seizure?
For about a third of people who have epilepsy that didn't respond to medications, it can be kind of life-changing. For a third, it shows some improvement, maybe not necessarily enough to stay on it. And then for about a third, they don't see any benefit.
And then what option does the other third have?
So surgery is another option. There's 2 types of surgeries for epilepsy. One is palliative surgery, which is not to cure the epilepsy, but to control the seizures. And that world is moving very quickly right now. So the oldest device is a vagal nerve stimulator. And then there's other devices that stimulate the brain directly as opposed to a nerve to try to decrease seizures. There's also
the neuropace.
Right. There's also surgeries that involve separating one half of the brain from the other half of the brain so seizures don't spread and cause children to fall. And then the category that everybody likes to do the most is the type which is trying to go for a cure. So basically, if there's a brain malformation that's causing too much excitement in the brain leading to seizure activity, then removing that with the goal of having seizure freedom afterwards.
Okay. So help me understand, like when you have seizure, it looks really horrible. For the patient, they don't realize that they have seizure. And what's the impact to their brain?
Yeah, so some people actually know they have seizures. Some seizures leave a memory. The person is aware completely during the seizure. Other times people don't know they have had a seizure, but will wake up with an unexplained injury or missing time or a severe headache. So people can miss seizures, but most people do know that there's something not quite right going on. In terms of the effect on the brain, the seizures don't damage the brain unless they're very, very prolonged. But epilepsy is hard to live with. And there's a lot of long-term information about how challenging it is. So, for example, people with epilepsy are less likely to graduate from college. They're less likely to get married.
Why is that? Why do you think?
Well, as opposed to other diseases where you may have warnings that things are getting worse, in epilepsy, it comes out of the blue. So, as a parent of 2 kids, I can imagine it'd be very hard to let one of my kids go to a sleepover if I didn't know, if I knew, for instance, that, sleep deprivation triggers a seizure in my child. And so, no, I don't want them to go to a sleepover because then they're more likely to have a seizure. And I don't want them to have a seizure in front of their friends. So what ends up happening is the child gets a view of themselves as being sick or different or needing to be protected. And it can be really hard to socially advance when you're kind of being kept back. All those years you're supposed to become more and more independent, you have your parents, appropriately so, concerned about your safety, kind of pulling your independence back.
So is there a way to, right now, to kind of help predict that, and so that it gives the parents a bit more ease about letting the kids do more, normal thing? Because if that's, it's like a chicken and egg, you want to protect them, but then at the same time, it can also harm them in the long run.
I think it's really hard for parents to be able to do both at the same time, to think long-term and to think kind of short-term. You also have to remember that if you don't remember the seizure, the person most traumatized by it was the person who witnessed it, which is usually the parent. So the parent has a lot of trauma from seeing this event that can be quite scary. And, many times it's hard to deal with all that stress.
Mm-hmm. So until we have the cure for that, what can we do as a society?
So one of the things that, for instance, children with food allergies have done is educate people about food allergies to keep these kids safer. In epilepsy, there's a lot of work being done by the Epilepsy Foundation and other groups to really destigmatize it so that if someone is having a seizure, that appropriate treatment is taken, and that treatment is not necessarily going to the emergency room. So that's one aspect of it. And I think that the stigma has decreased over time. But, there's still many instances where, if you follow the Epilepsy Foundation, they bring up in the media, for instance, a very negative, stigmatizing portrayal of epilepsy.
In a movie?
In a movie. And it hurts the whole community when that happens. Mm-hmm. So that's one challenge. I think there's a lot of work being done in the medical device space, which is where I am, to figure out, is there a way we can predict or keep people safe, or give doctors better information about how their treatment is working. Mm-hmm. So, I think that if we had some sort of indicator that could tell us, well, your epilepsy is very active right now, we need to do more, or your epilepsy is quiet right now, let's back down, that would be really helpful.
Do you mean back down in terms of the medication?
In terms of treatment, there's this funny thing that happens in epilepsy where people will go through prolonged remissions and not have seizures, and we don't understand why. Sometimes their epilepsy is active and why their epilepsy isn't active. There's no blood test, brain test you can do to figure out, oh, things are good right now. Oh, no, things aren't good right now.
So how do they deal with that now? Like, they have that and then they're in remission for a long time. They're just like, they know it's going to come at some point.
So
and make sure they're not driving when they have it.
So the data really comes from natural history studies. So it depends on what the cause of the epilepsy is. So for instance, people who have no known cause for their seizures are much more likely to do well in the long term than people who have known injuries causing their epilepsy. And we know that if somebody didn't have that many seizures, they're much more likely to have it go away than if when they first started having seizures, it came on with a vengeance. So there's a lot of natural history data that you can use, but there's no like hemoglobin A1C equivalent for epilepsy.
Do you think that's changing? Do you think there will be more data, more information? People are more interested in getting more of that marker?
I think there's a strong desire to. At this point, we seem still to be pretty far away.
Is it because of lack of resources, or they don't know what to check?
At this point, we don't have a good gauge. No way to really predict besides kind of natural history data. When is the next seizure coming? What's going to trigger it? How are we going to know beforehand? Those are all very important questions.
Yeah. So, you touched briefly earlier about, in the medical devices space. So you're working on something in that space, and what triggered you to being a doctor to say, okay, this is something that I want to pursue and explore?
So all I can envision are the many families that have sat in my office and explained to them, that your child has epilepsy and I don't know when the next seizure is going to come. And, just this stricken look on their faces, like, what do you mean? How am I going to sleep if I don't know if my child's having a seizure? What can I do? And then when you, as a physician, you look in the literature and say, okay, well, what can we do? Well, the state of the art right now is telling people to sleep next to their child. That's pretty primitive, in this day and age. And as a physician, you really feel like you're making treatment decisions that really affect people's lives in the dark. I'm relying on family-reported seizure counts. So, if a child is at school half the day, their teacher may not be noticing that they're having seizures. And then they come home and the parent may say, well, I saw one seizure, I think. And you're using that as a physician to make medical decisions. That doesn't feel great, right? Then the other thing that we find is that, families say my child's really irritable. And I don't know if their kid's irritable because they're tired or they're irritable because the medication's making them irritable and it's a side effect. Or maybe they're irritable because their parents are chasing them around with medications for the first time and they used to be able to do whatever. So, we have to make these decisions in this vacuum. And once you've made a treatment choice, then you have to follow it up. But you're still in the vacuum of hard data. That's not to say families aren't giving you a lot of information. It's just that
they don't have to.
They only have what they can observe, right? And, as parents, we may not always be the best reporters.
No.
So, my goal really was to develop something that could wrap around somebody and provide support to give the data that everybody needs so that, we know you had actually 10 seizures since we last saw you.
And that helps you as a clinician,
right,
to make decision on what treatment that they'll have.
It could also help the family sleep better at night, for instance, if they had a device that could identify seizures. And there's a couple devices on the market, but they've really focused on generalized tonic-clonic, kind of the classic convulsive seizure type.
What is that? What do you mean by that?
So that's the seizure that everybody thinks about, which is, somebody falls to the ground and has shaking of their arms and legs. And that's a very dangerous seizure type, but it makes up only about 25% of the total seizure burden. So all those other seizure types, which are more subtle, there's nothing on the market right now that can identify those.
Okay. And that is pretty big portion.
Yes.
Of the patient population.
Very large portion of the patient population.
This podcast is sponsored by Life Science, a Silicon Valley-based medtech design and development consultancy, transforming your technologies into a unique healthcare solution. For more information, visit their website at iolifescience.com. This podcast is also sponsored by Brown Ratnick's Global Life Sciences Group, a team of legal professionals that helps life science companies, lenders, and investors around the world turn good science into good business. Learn more at brownratnick.com. So I know you mentioned earlier that you're developing a new device to help identify seizures. And can you tell us what your technology, what you're trying to achieve with this particular technology?
Yeah, so it comes out of my clinical work. Families describing seizures to me, as well as running the epilepsy monitoring unit. I've watched many people have seizures. And one of the first symptoms of a seizure, and almost universal symptom, is a kind of a glazed over appearance, a change in facial expression. So given how far we've come in terms of technology, the concept was really to take these things that we're observing and describing and turn them into something that we can analyze. So what we've been working on is using eye movements to detect seizures, as well as the side effects of epilepsy, including the drowsiness and problems with processing speed and mood. And so the goal is really to develop a device that can help families, physicians, pharmaceutical companies really get a better handle on what the impact of epilepsy is, how it's affecting cognition, and give families a tool to really manage it.
So sometimes patients do get seizure when they're sleeping. That's why parents sleep. They're asked to sleep with them. How do you monitor their eye movement when they close their eyes?
So that's a good question. One of the first symptoms of seizures out of sleep is eye opening. So what we've developed for nighttime is going to be a goggle or a sleep mask that can be worn during sleep to pick up that eye opening and separate it from just an arousal, just to wake up.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's really interesting. So I know you're in the early stage of it, and I'm looking forward to see the progress that you make. So you work at the Children's Hospital in Oakland. And is there there's a center that's focused on the epilepsy there for kids, or is there a separate center somewhere else here in the UCSF San Francisco site?
So epilepsy is very common in pediatric neurology. It's about 50% of patients who come to the neurology clinic have epilepsy. So, certainly it falls within the bigger neurology umbrella. And then at UCSF, there's the brain center as well. And epilepsy falls within that.
Okay. Well, so now we can digress. I always ask people something that's a bit different from their work. What are the books that you read these days that's kind of fun, or something that you learn that more for me, so that I can get book review, book recommendation?
So I'm in a book club. We read lots of interesting books. It's interesting, though, that the best book club books aren't necessarily your favorite books. They're just the ones that spark the most discussion. I just read *Sapiens*.
Oh, I heard that one. That's on my list.
Excellent for nonfiction. I really like Bill Gates has a book list. That's excellent. And Tara Westover's book was recommended from that. It's a memoir called *Educated*. That was fascinating. The book that stuck in my mind most recently is a book called *The Mandibles*, which is a little dystopian that I really enjoyed reading. And I'm reading the Foundation series to my kids right now, which is interesting because I didn't realize quite how there are no women in that book until I was reading it to my kids. Everybody's male in that book.
Interesting.
I was like, oh, maybe we could ask Asimov to come back.
Now, last question before I let you go. How is it like now, you're a clinician for a while and now you're embarking on this entrepreneurial world? How do you navigate that, and has it been fun, or?
So, I think there's a couple things going on at the same time. One is in medicine, you get to enjoy being the expert and being a leader in that sense. And now I'm back to being a student again. So that's good. I mean, that's good for me. I really have enjoyed all the people that I've met who have, and I have to say that entrepreneurs are very kind and willing to talk to you. And, even when you ask very silly questions, and I found a lot of support in that community. I think the big challenge is, really charting a path when there is none. And there was a really funny piece on NPR about this guy wanted to get thicker skin, so he decided to embark upon 100 days of rejection. So he would go ask a question to somebody that he knew was going to get rejected at least once a day. And I feel that's a little bit the path of entrepreneurship, is you have to kind of get used to being rejected. And it's an important part of focusing what your goals are.
It gives you a lot of humility.
Definitely.
So, well, I hope it's been a fun one so far, being a student again. And thank you for sharing your story with us and helped me learn a lot more about epilepsy.
Thank you, Christine.